The drizzle fell on Northgate High with a kind of gray, institutional indifference, slicking the asphalt and blurring the faces of students hurrying toward the final bell. Alistair Finch stood by his classroom window, watching the water bead on the old glass, his reflection a pale, indistinct ghost. At 58, he felt as worn and transparent as the pain he looked through. For 30 years, he had taught history in this same room, a place that now smelled of chalk dust, floor wax, and the slow, quiet erosion of time. He was a fixture, as unremarkable as the scuffed linoleum, a man whose presence was noted only by its absence. Today, however, he was about to become visible in the worst possible way. The bell shrieked, a sound of ragged freedom, and the hallways erupted. Alistair gathered his worn leather briefcase, the clasp held together with a carefully wound paperclip, and stepped out into the torrent of teenage energy. That's when he saw it. Near the science labs, where the corridor narrowed into a bottleneck, Marcus Thorne had Leo Miller pinned against a bank of lockers. Marcus, with his Letterman jacket and easy, cruel smile, was the son of a man who had built half the new developments in town. He moved through the school with the unassailable confidence of a prince in his own kingdom. Leo, by contrast, was all sharp angles and nervous energy, a scholarship kid who carried his books like a shield. Marcus wasn't just talking. He had a fistful of Leo's shirt, bunching the cheap fabric under his chin. "I told you to finish my essay, Miller." Marcus's voice was a low snarl, meant only for Leo but audible to the dozen students who had slowed their pace, their curiosity a palpable, predatory thing. "You think you're too good for that?" Leo stammered, his face white with fear. I had my own work. I couldn't." Marcus slammed him against the metal door, the clang echoing down the hall. "Wrong answer." Alistair felt a familiar, sickening knot tighten in his stomach. It was the coward's knot, the one that whispered, "Look away. It's not your business. You can't change anything." He had listened to that voice for too long. He saw the other teachers hurrying past, their eyes deliberately averted. He saw the students forming a silent, watching circle. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was an accomplice. Taking a breath that felt thin and inadequate, Alistair moved forward. His shoes made no sound on the polished floor. "That's enough, Marcus," he said. His voice, usually reserved for lectures on the Magna Carta, sounded frail in the charged air. Marcus turned, his eyes narrowing in contempt. He let go of Leo, who sagged against the lockers. "Well, look what we have here," Marcus sneered, a wave of derisive chuckles rippling through the onlookers. "It's Mr. Finch. Gonna give me detention? Write me up for ungentlemanly conduct." He took a step toward Alistair, invading his space. The boy was a foot taller and radiated a potent, youthful arrogance. "This has nothing to do with you, old man. Go back to your dusty books." The humiliation was immediate and sharp. "Old man," the words landed like stones. Alistair could feel the dozens of pairs of eyes on him, judging his faded tweed jacket, his slightly stooped shoulders, his utter lack of authority. He was a joke, a relic. He simply looked at Marcus, his gaze unwavering. Let the boy go home, Marcus, for a moment. It seemed Marcus might shove him. The tension stretched thin. Then, with a final, dismissive laugh, Marcus turned away. "Whatever. I'm bored of this anyway." He gave Leo a hard shove as he passed, sending him stumbling. The crowd dispersed, the show over, leaving Alistair and Leo alone in the now empty hallway. The echo of laughter seemed to cling to the walls. Leo wouldn't meet his eyes. "Thank you, sir," he mumbled to the floor, before gathering his dropped books and scurrying away, as if ashamed to have been associated with such a pathetic rescue. Alistair stood there for a long time, his briefcase handle clenched in his fist, the paperclip digging into his palm. He had done something, but it felt like nothing. He had only succeeded in making himself a target, confirming his own irrelevance in a world that belonged to the loud, the strong, and the cruel. The knot in his stomach had not loosened. It had simply turned to ice. The summons came the next morning via a crisp, impersonal email. "Mr. Finch, please see me in my office at your earliest convenience. Principal Thompson." Alistair knew what it was about. The air in the principal's office was stale, smelling of coffee and quiet desperation. Franklin Thompson was a man who governed by spreadsheet and risk assessment. His tie was perfectly knotted, a small, tight noose of compliance. He gestured for Alistair to sit, his face a carefully curated mask of managerial concern. "Al," he began, the false familiarity setting Alistair's teeth on edge. "I heard there was an incident in the hallway yesterday." With Marcus Thorne, Alistair simply nodded. Marcus was harassing another student. I intervened. Thompson steepled his fingers, a gesture he'd probably learned at a leadership seminar. Intervened. That's one word for it. His father called me this morning. He used a different one. Accosted, he said you publicly humiliated his son. The absurdity of the statement was breathtaking. Alistair felt a slow burn of anger, a feeling so foreign it was almost startling. Marcus had a boy pinned against a locker, Franklin. There were 20 witnesses. Witnesses who remember a popular student having a conversation and a teacher making a scene. Thompson countered, his voice smooth as polished stone. Robert Thorne is the head of the school board's fundraising committee. His firm is building the new science wing pro bono. We have to be delicate. The word hung in the air, a euphemism for complicit. The systemic indifference was no longer a passive force. It had a name and a face and a checkbook. Thompson leaned forward, his mask slipping to reveal the raw pragmatism beneath. I need you to let this go, Alistair. Marcus is a high-spirited boy, but he's not malicious. You're a history teacher. Teach history. Leave the discipline to me and my staff. The implication was clear. You are not equipped for this. You are a dusty academic, not a disciplinarian. Your authority begins and ends at your classroom door. And what about Leo Miller? Alistair asked, his voice quiet but firm. Does he not deserve to feel safe in this school? Thompson sighed, a sound of profound weariness. The world isn't always fair, El. That's a history lesson you should know better than anyone. Just stay out of it. It's for the best. Alistair walked out of the office feeling colder than before. The principal's words had drawn a clear, unbreachable line. The school would not protect Leo. It would protect itself. Emboldened by his victory, Marcus escalated his campaign. It was no longer about an essay. It was about power. He and his friends made Leo's life a living hell. They accidentally knocked his lunch tray from his hands in the crowded cafeteria, the splatter of milk and mashed potatoes earning a roar of laughter. They scrawled the word, snitch, in permanent marker across his locker, a message the janitors couldn't completely scrub away. They shouldered him in the hallways, followed him to the library, their whispers and jeers a constant, corrosive presence. Alistair watched it all, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He saw the fear in Leo's eyes curdle into a kind of vacant resignation. The boy was shrinking, folding in on himself, trying to become invisible. Each incident was a fresh cut, a reminder of Alistair's own impotence. He followed the principal's directive, staying out of it physically, but the conflict raged inside him. He felt the eyes of other teachers on him in the staff lounge, a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them. He was the old man who had picked a fight he couldn't win. His quiet dignity, the only thing he had ever truly possessed, was being stripped away, layer by layer, with every silent act of cruelty he was forced to witness. The school had become a microcosm of a world he no longer understood, a place where honor was a liability and silence was the price of survival. That evening, the silence in Alistair's small, meticulously kept apartment felt different. It was heavier, freighted with the day's failures. He sat in his worn armchair, the reading lamp casting a warm, lonely circle of light on a book he couldn't bring himself to open. His gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, to the silver-framed photograph of his wife, Eleanor. She had been gone for 5 years, but her presence was woven into the very fabric of the room. In the neatly arranged books, the scent of lavender potpourri, the quiet order of things. Her smile in the photograph was bright and fearless, a stark contrast to the timid man he felt he had become. He had not always been this way. Before Eleanor, he had been a man who preferred the safety of the sidelines, an observer of life rather than a participant. She had seen something in him he hadn't seen in himself. She was a nurse, a woman who ran toward crises, not away from them. She had faced her final illness with a kind of incandescent courage that had both awed and shamed him. "You have to stand for something, Ali," she used to tell him, her voice weak but her eyes blazing. "Even if it's small, even if no one else sees it, you have to hold your ground. Otherwise, you're just a ghost drifting through." He was a ghost now. He closed his eyes, the memory of her brother surfacing, unbidden. Jake. Her younger brother was a man forged from different materials entirely. He was a creature of leather and chrome, a man who had left their quiet town decades ago, in a cloud of exhaust fumes, and joined a world Alistair only knew from sensationalized news reports. The Hells Angels. Alistair had only met him a handful of times, at the wedding and later, tragically, at Eleanor's funeral. Jake, with his shaven head, sprawling tattoos, and the formidable presence of a mountain that had learned to walk, had terrified Alistair's family. But Eleanor had adored him. She saw the fierce loyalty beneath the intimidating exterior. At the funeral, while everyone else offered platitudes, Jake had stood beside Alistair, a silent, solid bulwark of shared grief. He hadn't said much, just gripped Alistair's shoulder with a hand the size of a dinner plate and said, "She was the best of us. You need anything, ever, you call." He had scrawled a number on a napkin, a number Alistair had tucked into an old wallet and promptly forgotten. It seemed a lifetime ago, a different world. Alistair got up and walked to his desk, pulling out the cracked leather wallet. Tucked behind an old library card was the folded napkin. The ink was faded, but the name Breaker and a phone number were still legible. He stared at it, a relic from a life of action he could barely comprehend. What would a man like that think of him now? A man who let a boy be tormented, who followed orders to be delicate. The shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread across his chest. He had chosen to teach history because he believed in its lessons, in the power of individuals to alter the course of events, in the moral clarity of standing against injustice. He lectured on the quiet defiance of Rosa Parks, the steadfast courage of Thomas More. Yet when faced with his own small, shabby test, he had failed. He was teaching lessons he was no longer capable of living. He put the napkin back. Calling Jake was impossible. This was his battle, his failure. Eleanor's memory demanded he find his own ground to hold, no matter how small or precarious it might seem. He looked back at her picture, at her smiling, expectant eyes. He had to do more than just intervene. He had to stand. The pressure in the school corridors became a tangible thing, a low-grade hum of anxiety that followed Leo Miller everywhere he went. His tormentors grew bolder in the vacuum of administrative inaction. The bullying was no longer confined to verbal taunts or stolen lunch money. It had taken on a more sinister, physical edge. One afternoon, Leo came to Alistair's history class late, his face pale and his jacket sleeve torn at the shoulder. He slid into his seat at the back of the room, keeping his head down, hoping to remain unnoticed. But Alistair noticed. He saw the slight tremor in the boy's hands as he opened his textbook. He saw the way Leo flinched when another student dropped a book nearby. The boy was living on a razor's edge of fear, and the entire school community seemed content to watch him bleed. Alistair felt a suffocating sense of isolation. His colleagues, once friendly enough, now offered him curt nods in the hallway, their eyes skittering away from his. They knew what was happening to Leo, and they knew Alistair had tried to stop it and been reprimanded. His failure was a warning to them all. Do not get involved. The silence in the teacher's lounge was the loudest sound in the building. It was a chorus of self-preservation, a collective agreement to look the other way. Even the students, many of whom were decent kids at heart, were paralyzed by the unwritten laws of high school hierarchy. To defend Leo was to become a target themselves. So they watched, their silence a form of passive participation, their inaction weaving another thread in the net that was tightening around the boy. Alistair tried to reach out to Leo to offer some form of sanctuary. He asked him to stay after class one day, ostensibly to discuss a late assignment. The boy stood before his desk, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on a crack in the floor. "Leo, if you need to talk, my door is always open," Alistair said gently. "What's happening?" "It isn't right." Leo just shook his head, a barely perceptible movement. "It's fine, Mr. Finch. I'm fine." The words were a lie, a shield of pride and terror. He was afraid to talk, afraid that speaking would only make it worse. He had seen what happened to the teacher who had tried to help him. He had been publicly humiliated and silenced. What hope did a student have? "You don't have to go through this alone," Alistair pressed, his voice filled with an empathy that felt agonizingly useless. "No one should have to." For the first time, Leo looked up, and Alistair saw the profound hopelessness in his eyes. It was a look that went far beyond the typical teenage angst. It was the look of someone who had accepted their fate as a victim. "Thanks, sir," he mumbled. "But it's better if you just don't." He turned and fled the classroom, leaving Alistair standing in the empty room with the weight of his own inadequacy. That day, the crisis escalated. During the last period, Alistair saw Marcus and two of his friends follow Leo out of the building. They weren't laughing or joking. Their expressions were cold, purposeful. A knot of dread tightened in Alistair's gut. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that something terrible was about to happen. He grabbed his briefcase, his heart pounding against his ribs. He was just one man, an old teacher nobody listened to. The community was silent. The administration had tied his hands. He was utterly alone. But as he walked out of the classroom and into the gray afternoon, he remembered Eleanor's voice, clear as a bell in his mind. "You have to hold your ground." He walked faster, his path leading not to the faculty parking lot, but toward the secluded bike racks at the far end of the school grounds. The air behind the gymnasium was damp and cold, heavy with the smell of wet earth and chain link. This was one of the school's forgotten corners, a place of cracked pavement and overgrown weeds, shielded from the view of the main building. It was here that Marcus Thorne and his two hulking friends had cornered Leo. They had him backed up against the metal fence, the diamond-shaped wire pressing into his thin back. Leo's backpack was on the ground, its contents, books, papers, a carefully drawn comic book, spilled across the wet concrete. One of Marcus's friends, a football player named Kyle, was methodically tearing pages from Leo's sketchbook, letting the pieces flutter to the ground like dead leaves. "What's this garbage, Miller?" Kyle sneered, holding up a drawing of a superhero. "You think some fantasy freak is gonna come save you?" Leo was trembling, but his eyes were fixed on the destruction of his work, his one escape. "Please stop." Marcus stepped forward, a predator closing in. "We're just getting started," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You and your teacher friend embarrassed me, and nobody embarrasses me." He shoved Leo hard against the fence. "You're going to learn a lesson about respect." It was at that moment that Alistair Finch rounded the corner. He wasn't running. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace, his old leather briefcase held firmly in one hand. He stopped about 10 feet away, a quiet, unassuming figure in a tweed jacket, looking utterly out of place in this tableau of brutal intimidation. The three boys turned, their expressions a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Seriously?" Marcus scoffed, an incredulous laugh escaping his lips. "You just don't learn, do you, old man? I told you to stay out of it." Alistair set his briefcase down carefully on the dry patch of pavement beneath the gym's awning. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He simply looked at Marcus, his gaze direct and unyielding. "That's enough, Marcus. The boy has had enough." He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing directly between the bullies and their victim. He had placed himself in the path of the violence, a human shield. His heart hammered in his chest, a frantic bird beating against his ribs, but his posture was straight, his resolve solid. "Get out of my way, Finch," Marcus snarled, his face twisting in rage. This was no longer about Leo. It was a direct challenge to his authority, his dominance. "I'm warning you." Alistair didn't move. He just stood there, a silent sentinel. The selfless act was not in fighting, but in enduring. He was a history teacher, He knew that some battles were won not with fists, but with the sheer, stubborn refusal to yield. Enraged by this quiet defiance, Marcus shoved him. He pushed with all his weight, expecting the old man to stumble and fall. Alistair staggered back a step, his heel catching on a crack in the pavement, but he regained his balance. He planted his feet and stood his ground, his eyes never leaving Marcus's. "No," he said, the single word imbued with all the conviction he possessed. That was when the punch came. Marcus, blinded by fury and humiliation, swung wildly. It was a clumsy, powerful blow aimed at Leo, who flinched behind Alistair's back. But Alistair saw it coming. He didn't try to dodge it. He didn't raise his hands to block it. He simply took it. The impact was a sickening thud. The punch caught him high on the cheekbone, snapping his head to the side. Pain, sharp and electric, exploded behind his eye. His glasses flew off his face and skittered across the concrete. He went down to one knee, the rough ground scraping his trousers, but he did not fall completely. He stayed there on one knee, his head bowed for a moment, the world swimming in a dizzying blur. Then, slowly, painfully, he lifted his head. He looked past Marcus, his gaze finding Leo's terrified face. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "It's all right. I'm still here." He had not fought back. He had not lost his dignity. He had simply absorbed the violence and in doing so had broken its power. The three bullies stood frozen, stunned by the sight of the teacher on his knee, his cheek already swelling, refusing to be defeated. The scene hung in the air, suspended in a moment of shocked silence. From the far end of the walkway, a handful of students who had been cutting across the field to the student parking lot had seen the whole thing. They had stopped, hidden partially by a large oak tree, expecting to see the teacher run, or yell for help, or be utterly humiliated. Instead, they saw something else entirely. They saw Mr. Finch, the quiet, dusty history teacher, take a full-force punch from the school's alpha predator without making a sound. They saw him get knocked to one knee and then, impossibly, look up not with fear or anger, but with a kind of profound, unbreakable calm. The usual snickers and jeers that followed such confrontations were absent. No one laughed. The image was too stark, too raw. It was the image of a man, old and physically outmatched, sacrificing his own safety for a terrified student. Marcus and his friends, suddenly unnerved by the teacher's resilience and the unexpected audience, backed away. "You're crazy, old man," Marcus muttered, his bravado gone, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He and his friends quickly disappeared, their retreat more of a flight than a casual departure. Alistair remained on one knee for a long moment, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The pain in his cheek was a fierce, throbbing thing. Leo rushed forward, his fear momentarily forgotten in a wave of concern. "Mr. Finch, are you okay?" "I'm so sorry." Alistair looked up at the boy and managed a weak, lopsided smile. "I'm all right, Leo," he said, his voice a little hoarse. He pushed himself slowly to his feet, his joints protesting. "The important thing is, are you?" Leo could only nod, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and guilt. He retrieved Alistair's glasses, one of the lenses cracked neatly down the middle. He handed them to his teacher with the reverence of someone handling a sacred object. The small group of students by the tree began to disperse, but they did so quietly, thoughtfully. The story began to ripple through the school's social network before the last bus had even left the parking lot. It wasn't a story of a teacher getting beaten up. It was a story of a teacher who stood his ground. The narrative, whispered in hallways and texted from phone to phone, began to shift. The image of the pathetic old man was replaced by something new, something harder to define. He hadn't won the fight in any conventional sense, but he hadn't lost either. He had revealed a core of strength no one knew he possessed. The next morning, as Alistair walked into school, his cheek a canvas of purple and blue, the atmosphere was different. The students in the hallways didn't stare and laugh. They fell quiet as he passed. Some of them, the braver ones, met his eye and gave a small, respectful nod. They saw the bruise not as a mark of defeat, but as a badge of honor. He was no longer Mr. Finch, the boring history teacher. He was the man who took a punch for Leo Miller. In his first period class, the students were silent and attentive. Their respect was a palpable force in the room. Leo sat in his usual spot, but he wasn't hunched over. He sat up straighter, his fear replaced by a quiet sense of security. He looked at the mark on Alistair's face and understood, perhaps for the first time, what true courage looked like. It wasn't about being the strongest or the loudest. It was about standing up when it was easier to stay down. The whispers had started, a subtle but significant shift in the school's social tectonic plates. Alistair Finch was no longer invisible. He had become a legend in the making. His quiet act of defiance, a silent rebuke to the cruelty and indifference that had been allowed to fester for so long. It began as a vibration, a low, guttural thrum that seemed to rise from the very asphalt of the street outside Northgate High. At first, it was faint enough to be mistaken for a passing truck or distant construction. But it didn't fade. It grew, deepening from a hum into a growl, then a roar, a ground-shaking concussion of sound that rattled the windows in their frames and made the coffee in the teacher's lounge tremble. Students and faculty alike were drawn to the windows, their faces pressed against the glass, their expressions a mixture of confusion and alarm. What they saw defied all reason. A single motorcycle, a massive, gleaming Harley-Davidson, turned onto the school's long entrance road. It was followed by another and then another. They came in a seemingly endless procession, a river of black leather, polished chrome, and roaring steel. They moved with a disciplined, intimidating grace, filling the road 2 by 2. 10 bikes became 50. 50 became 100. They kept coming, pouring into the school's circular driveway and expansive parking lot, until at least 200 motorcycles had surrounded the building. The sheer, overwhelming presence of them was breathtaking. They were Hell's Angels. Their vests, emblazoned with the iconic Death's Head patch, were a clear and unambiguous declaration of identity. They were large men, weathered and bearded, their faces set like stone. They moved as one, a unified force of raw, untamed power. Then, as if orchestrated by a single, unseen conductor, every engine cut out at once. The sudden, absolute silence that followed the deafening roar was more shocking than the noise itself. The world seemed to hold its breath. Doors on the bikes opened and closed with solid, metallic clicks. Boots, heavy and scuffed, hit the pavement. The men dismounted, their collective presence transforming the mundane school grounds into something tense and volatile. From the front of the formation, one man emerged. He was bigger than the rest, with a shaved head that revealed a map of old scars and a thick, graying beard. The patch on his vest read Breaker. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, his eyes scanning the front of the school as if he were a general surveying a battlefield. The students who had been outside froze. Teachers peered from behind locked classroom doors. Principal Thompson stood in his office, his face ashen, staring at the impossible sight. This was not a random event. They were here for a reason. They were looking for someone. Breaker's gaze swept over the crowd of frightened, curious faces pressed against the windows. He ignored them. His focus was singular, his purpose clear. He started walking toward the main entrance, 2 of his lieutenants falling into step behind him. The sea of bikers parted for him, a silent, disciplined army awaiting his command. The air crackled with a tension that was thicker than the scent of gasoline and leather. Northgate High had been invaded by a force it could not comprehend, a brotherhood of outsiders who operated by a code entirely their own. The quiet, orderly world of bells and textbooks had just collided with something ancient, primal, and utterly unforgiving. And nobody, least of all Alistair Finch, who was in the library helping a student find a book on the Roman Empire, had any idea what was about to happen. Inside the school, a wave of panicked whispers spread faster than fire. Principal Thompson, his face slick with sweat, was on the phone with the police, his voice a high, strained squeak. Security guards stood near the entrance, looking small and utterly useless against the backdrop of the leather-clad army outside. Breaker and his two men walked through the main doors as if they owned the building. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, a sound of mundane welcome for a most unwelcome arrival. The bikers stopped just inside the atrium, their sheer physical presence silencing the entire hallway. Breaker's eyes, chips of cold blue ice, scanned the faces of the students huddled against the walls. "I'm looking for Leo Miller," he said. His voice was a low rumble, a sound that carried the weight of gravel and authority. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. From the back of a crowd of frightened freshmen, Leo slowly emerged. He looked terrified, but also something else. A flicker of recognition, of desperate hope. He had made the call last night, his voice shaking, after Alistair's sacrifice had finally broken through his wall of fear. He had called the number his mother had given him for emergencies, the number for the uncle he barely knew, the man she always called Jake. Breaker's heart expression softened almost imperceptibly as he saw the boy. He walked over to Leo, ignoring the gasps from the onlookers, and placed a heavy, tattooed hand on his nephew's shoulder. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice now gentle, meant only for Leo. Leo nodded, unable to speak, tears welling in his eyes. "Heard you had some trouble," Breaker continued, "and that someone stood up for you. A teacher." He looked around the atrium. "Where is he?" At that moment, Alistair Finch, alerted by the commotion, came walking down the main corridor from the library. He stopped short when he saw the scene, the bikers, the terrified students, and Leo standing with the formidable man in the Hells Angels vest. His eyes widened in disbelief as he recognized the man's face, not from the news, but from a faded photograph on his own mantelpiece. "Jake," Alistair said, the name a quiet breath of astonishment. Breaker turned his head, his eyes locking onto Alistair. He saw the faded tweed jacket, the cracked glasses, and the livid purple bruise blooming on his cheek. Recognition dawned, followed by a slow, dawning comprehension. "Alistair," he rumbled, his voice thick with surprise. "Eleanor's husband?" He took a step toward Alistair, his gaze fixed on the injury. "That mark on your face. That's from them? The ones who hurt the kid?" Alistair could only nod, still trying to process the surreal collision of his two worlds. Breaker turned back to his men, his voice now booming through the silent school, filled with a cold, righteous fury. "This man," he declared, pointing a thumb at Alistair, "is family, my sister's husband. He stood for my nephew when no one else would. He took a punch meant for this boy." He then looked at Alistair, and the respect in his eyes was absolute. "Eleanor always said you were a good man, quiet man but a solid one." She was right. The connection was revealed. A stunning, unbelievable truth that ricocheted through the stunned crowd. The beaten-down history teacher and the fearsome biker president were brothers-in-law. The quiet act of courage in the back alley had just summoned an army. The truth about Alistair's past, his connection to a world of fierce, unwavering loyalty, had come to light in the most dramatic way imaginable. He was not just a teacher, he was protected. He was family. The entire dynamic of Northgate High shifted on its axis. The fear that had permeated the school moments before was now focused, like a laser, on one specific place: the principal's office. Breaker, with Alistair and Leo in tow, strode down the hallway, the crowd of students and teachers parting before them like the Red Sea. Principal Thompson was already in his office, along with a furious Robert Thorne and his son, Marcus. Thorne had been in the middle of a tirade, demanding Alistair be fired for assaulting his son, when the office door swung open. The sight of the three bikers filling the doorway, their vests seeming to suck all the light and air out of the room, stopped him mid-sentence. His blustering, entitled rage evaporated, replaced by a primal, instinctive fear. His face went from flushed red to a pasty white. Marcus, who had been smirking behind his father, looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Breaker didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence was a physical force, a promise of consequences far beyond a school suspension. He ignored the principal and fixed his cold gaze on Robert Thorne. "You're Thorne," he stated. It wasn't a question. Your boy put his hands on my nephew, and he put his hands on my brother-in-law. He gestured toward Alistair's bruised face. This is a problem. A big 1-inch Robert Thorne, a man used to bulldozing his way through any obstacle with money and influence, found his voice stuck in his throat. He looked from the biker to Principal Thompson, but the principal was staring at his desk, suddenly fascinated by a paperclip. There was no help to be found there. Now, there was a misunderstanding, Thorne stammered, his bravado crumbling into dust. Boys will be boys. I'm sure we can compensate. You think this is about money? Breaker took a step into the room, and Thorne flinched back. This is about respect. Something your son clearly doesn't understand. And it seems he learned it from you. He then turned to Principal Thompson. This school is going to keep my nephew safe, and Mr. Finch will be treated with the respect he has earned. Nothing will happen to his job. Nothing will happen to him. Are we clear? Thompson nodded furiously, unable to form words. The balance of power had been irrevocably altered. The school's systemic indifference had just run headlong into a brotherhood's absolute loyalty. Breaker wasn't finished. He reached inside his vest and pulled out a small, folded object. He handed it to Alistair. It was a patch, smaller than the ones on his vest, intricately embroidered with a single, stylized silver wing. This is a friend of the club patch, Breaker said, his voice low enough for only those in the room to hear. It's a symbol. It means you're under our protection. Anyone who bothers you, bothers us. Alistair looked at the patch in his hand. It was a small thing, but it felt impossibly heavy, a token of a world he never knew, earned through an act of quiet courage. It was the ultimate symbol of recognition. In that moment, the entire community, from the cowering principal to the stunned students watching from the hallway, understood. Alistair Finch, the man they had dismissed and ignored, was not someone to be trifled with. He was a man of honor, and honor had been answered with honor. Marcus Thorne was suspended indefinitely, and his father, for the first time in his life, was utterly silenced, his power rendered meaningless in the face of a code he could not comprehend. The departure of the Hells Angels was as dramatic as their arrival. There were no more words. The point had been made. Breaker gave Alistair a firm, respectful nod, squeezed Leo's shoulder one last time, and then turned and walked out of the school. His men, who had been standing like sentinels throughout the building and parking lot, fell into step behind him. The school watched in silent awe as they mounted their bikes. Then, with a single, unified roar, 200 engines burst to life, a thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the building. They pulled out of the parking lot in their disciplined formation, a parade of chrome and leather, and disappeared down the road, their roar slowly fading until only a quiet hum remained. Then silence. But it was a different kind of silence than the one that had reigned before. This silence was filled with respect, with a new understanding. The world of Northgate High had been permanently changed. The next day, when Alistair Finch walked through the school doors, his glasses still cracked, the bruise on his cheek a fading testament to his ordeal, the atmosphere was one of reverence. The hallways didn't just quiet, they parted for him. Students who had once ignored him now looked at him with admiration. Teachers who had averted their gaze now met his eye and nodded, a clear acknowledgement of his courage. He was no longer invisible. He had become the school's moral compass. He walked to his classroom, and as he passed Leo's locker, he saw that the word snitch had been scrubbed away completely. In its place, someone had taped up a small, hand-drawn picture of a superhero with a tweed jacket. He found Leo in his classroom, helping another student with their homework. The boy looked up as Alistair entered and gave him a smile. A genuine, unguarded smile, the first Alistair had ever seen from him. The fear was gone, replaced by a newfound confidence. Alistair began his lesson, his voice carrying a new weight, a new authority that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with earned respect. He was teaching them about the Battle of Thermopylae, about the 300 Spartans who held their ground against an overwhelming force. For the first time, the story felt deeply, personally resonant. As he spoke of honor, sacrifice, and quiet courage. His students listened with an intensity they had never shown before. They weren't just learning history. They were looking at the man who had lived it. After school, Alistair sat alone in his quiet classroom, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. He took out his wallet and looked at the silver wing Patchbreaker had given him. He didn't need to display it. It wasn't a trophy. It was a quiet reminder, a symbol of an unexpected brotherhood and a testament to the fact that sometimes the most powerful statement one can make is to simply stand your ground. The motorcycles were gone. The roar faded into memory, but their echo remained. It was in the newfound safety in Leo's eyes, in the respectful nods in the hallway, and in the quiet, unshakable dignity of a history teacher who had finally and truly become a part of the story.